Raised near Philadelphia in Bucks County at Andalusia, a National Historic Landmark and certainly an outstanding example of domestic 19th century Greek Revival architecture in the United States. He continues to reside there. Mr. Biddle is a graduate of Princeton, 1951. At Princeton, he majored in art and archaeology and won an award for his thesis on his great-great-grandfather entitled Nicholas Biddle, The Influence of an Amateur on the Arts. Following graduation, he worked in Washington for the United States government and served in Japan with the United States Army. From 1955 to 1967, he served on the staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Mr. Biddle became president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation January the 1st in 1968, when its staff consisted of 49 persons and its membership stood at just under 13,000. The organization was focused principally on the East Coast and principally upon historic museum properties. During his presidency, from 1968 to 1980, the National Trust became truly national in actions and interests, serving preservationists through regional offices located in 6 cities with 200 employees and a membership of just over 155,000 people. This included some 150 major corporations and over 1,800 member preservation organizations. While maintaining historic museums and helping others do the same around the country, the National Trust has become a catalyst to help Americans in their efforts to conserve and rehabilitate urban neighborhoods and business districts, to save sound historic buildings by putting them to new uses, to conserve historic spaces and rural settings for small towns, and to preserve America's maritime heritage. At the request of Mrs. John F. Kennedy, he served as an advisor to the White House Fine Arts Commission. Mr. Biddle also served on the consulting committee to the National Survey of Historic Sites and Buildings and was a member of the board of directors of the White House Historical Association. He is, at the present, chairman of the State Historic Preservation Board of Pennsylvania and president of the Board of Trustees of the Andalusia Foundation, which owns and operates the Andalusia property at the National Historic Landmark. Mr. Biddle, and the title of his presentation, Preservation Today. But prior to his beginning his presentation, I would appreciate if you would sign in, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I've been in most towns and cities in America, but I've never been in Muncie, nor have I seen the television series. So I come with a fresh, open mind to look at some of the things you're doing here. Obviously, things are going very well at Ball State, because the last time I addressed a university group, the audience was filled with students carrying placards, because the Board of Trustees of that university had just announced that they were going to demolish the last surviving oldest building on the campus to replace it with a reproduction of a 1920s Georgian building. So the students were spilling over the balconies and through the windows, and needless to say, I had been clued in on this, so what else but to denounce the administration. The president of that university had an important dinner to go to, so we only arrived halfway through my speech. But by this point, the students were chanting and applauding like mad as I was denouncing the administration for their programs. And at the end of the talk, the president came forward and said he would be perfectly happy to deliver me at once to the faculty club where I was dumped, and told that the car would pick me up at 7 o'clock the next morning to take me away from the university. So obviously all is well here, and you're not demolishing anything at the moment. Well, for me, this evening is a return to an earlier era, an era I thought I had left behind. I really refer not so much to the 12 years that I served as president of the National Trust and talked about historic preservation, it seems, ad nauseum, but rather I did believe that during the past decade, we preservationists had secured our cause and established a very effective partnership at the national, state, and local levels. It is indeed ironic that as we celebrate yet another National Historic Preservation Week with the theme, Reinvesting in America's Past, this partnership is in the greatest danger and the reinvestment in jeopardy. Well, how has this all come about? I'd like briefly to go back through the years to the origins of the historic preservation movement, then to review what is happening today and the philosophies underlying the movement, and finally, touch a bit on the crises of the moment. Well, the first instance of preservation in the United States, we'll see if it works, came about in 1816 when the city of Philadelphia bought Independence Hall from the state of Pennsylvania in order to save it. The state actually was intending to raise the building for commercial development. An early nationwide preservation effort among individuals was the successful work of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association under Anna Pamela Cunningham to buy and preserve George Washington's plantation home on the Potomac, which was accomplished in 1859. From that beginning, the Trust estimates that there are now some 4,000 historic structures that are open to the public, some saved by local, state, and federal governments, but many, perhaps the majority, saved by individuals and private groups. What were these individuals and private groups trying to save? In his book, Charles Hosmer, and the book is called Presence of the Past, and it is a history of the preservation movement. Charles writes, although people paid lip service to the idea of architectural preservation, the vast majority of the houses saved before 1926 had some connection with important events or people. Now, why did private citizens want to save houses connected with important events or people? Hosmer goes on to say, if any single factor can be considered the motivating force behind the majority of preservation efforts, it certainly would be the hope that historic house museums would contribute to patriotic education. Many earnest individuals believed that revived patriotism could help to cure some of the social and political ills that were current in the United States. Elsewhere, Mr. Hosmer says, many preservationists widen their definition of patriotism to include nobility of character. They hoped that historic buildings could help to curb the sordid commercialism of the era of big business. Now, whether those hopes were achieved, I'll leave that to decide for yourself. At any rate, preservation has moved far beyond that philosophy, perhaps because we have no living national heroes today, and maybe because we look around and don't find individuals on the national scene who are necessarily distinguished by nobility of character. But that's somebody else's talk, not mine. The fact is that preservation hasn't changed drastically since those days, and the United States Congress has to be given considerable credit for this. In the Historic Sites Act of 1935, Congress declared for the first time a national policy of historic preservation. 14 years later, Congress chartered the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a private, non-profit, educational corporation. Our charter, the charter of the Trust, charges it with two major responsibilities. First, to facilitate public participation in the preservations of sites, buildings, and objects of national significance or interest, which means that the Trust is able to recruit new preservationists from among the private sector and to help others with their efforts. Secondly, the Trust was empowered to receive donations of sites, buildings, and objects significant in American history and culture, and to preserve and administer them for the public. In 1966, Congress adopted the National Historic Preservation Act. The law broadened the federal government's official interest to include the preservation of historic resources of state and local significance, as well as those of national importance. Congress also directed the Secretary of the Interior to establish the National Register of Historic Places, and also authorized matching grants to help develop state historic preservation plans, to identify properties of state and local significance, to identify properties of state and local significance potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and I know many of you here are working on those things, and to maintain and restore properties listed in that National Register. Congress also established the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to review any federal action that would have an impact upon National Register properties. Now, we know that eras in history do not open and end with the conciseness that history books imply. But I think we can date the modern phase of historical preservation from the mid-1960s to the present. You'll recall that we left historic preservation pretty well confined to the historic museum property. Well, let's look at what historic preservation is really like today. I think we can safely say that it has become a grassroots citizens movement. This has added different initiatives to the traditional historic museum or property. But these historic museums and properties are still an integral part of the preservation movement. The National Trust, for example, has 9 historic museum properties that we own and interpret to the public. And our administrators and interpreters are attempting to make them into a good deal more than museums, and to make them living laboratories of preservation approaches and techniques. And when Jim Massey worked at the National Trust, he was a leader in developing these new uses of our properties. Well, for example, our museums include Chesterwood at Stockbridge, Massachusetts. That's the summer home and studio, which you see here, of Daniel Chester French, the sculptor of the seated Lincoln in Washington, and of course the sculptor of your memorial to the Ball family, only a block or so from here. Then there is Lyndhurst, perhaps the greatest surviving example in this country of the Gothic Revival style, which is located on the Hudson River and built by A.J. Davis in several periods in the early 19th century. There's Drayton Hall, which is near Charleston, South Carolina, perhaps one of the most outstanding examples of 18th century American Palladian architecture existing today, particularly unique because it has survived absolutely untouched. No one put any water, electricity, heat, or anything into it, and it is almost an intact 18th century building. And in New Iberia, Louisiana, we have a townhouse of a planter called Shadows on the Teche. We own and have leased to others to operate other properties. For example, this is the original home and studio of Frank Lloyd Wright in Oak Park, Illinois. We helped a local preservation group acquire this property and have leased it to them, and they run it for the National Trust. And in California, we acquired Farloley, an estate just south of San Francisco, a 20th century estate, but particularly noted for its extraordinary gardens. So you see the museum property is integral, and preservation's current initiatives represent an expansion of our interests to include that typical as well as the unique, and architectural styles of the Victorian Art Deco periods as well as earlier designs. Preservationists today are interested in roadside diners, early gasoline stations, steam locomotives, old factories, movie palaces, skyscrapers. The list is nearly limitless. When Jim and I were driving here from Cincinnati today, we did comment, though, I wonder who is really going to find the mobile home of great preservation concern. So the philosophy now, I think, coming broadly in the nation is that to preserve is the best, and we are seeing less and less of this sort of thing when Detroit felt perfectly free to go ahead and demolish its old city hall. Well, what are some recent initiatives? One is neighborhood conservation, of which you are involved here, right here in Muncie. All across the country, we are seeing urban neighborhoods being, and this is LaDroit Park in Washington, being revitalized, the houses being restored, and a sense of neighborhood being recaptured. The initiative and energy come from individuals and from citizens groups, with the cooperation by local governments in declaring these neighborhoods to be historic districts and in pledging adequate municipal services and amenities. These efforts encompass not just neighborhoods of substantial townhouses from the 18th and 19th century, but neighborhoods of modest workers' houses, such as you see here in Butchertown, a neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky. The Trust has helped neighborhood groups establish revolving funds by making low-interest loans and guarantees of credit from our various preservation funds. The second initiative is applying the historic district concept to business districts as well. Probably the outstanding national example of this is in the Pioneer Square Historic District in Seattle. In the mid-1960s, the Pioneer Square area, which was Seattle's original business district, had turned into its Skid Row, with all the crime statistics and vacant, boarded-up buildings could go with that status. Today, Pioneer Square is a bustling, vital, dynamic business area and a tourist attraction as well. A clear-cut municipal government commitment to revitalizing Pioneer Square led the way for what has been a remarkable turnabout. The city invested $2.1 million in public funds and in turn attracted $18 million in private investment, and this was several years ago, so I'm sure those figures have changed. The third initiative in historic preservation is an adaptive use of sound old buildings that have outlived their original function, and there will be a presentation, I believe, of that tomorrow. Of some of your buildings right in your downtown area. And the list could be overwhelming of this. But for example, we have Boston's old City Hall, which was, instead of being demolished, has been converted into private offices and one of the best restaurants in town. Chattanooga's old train station is a hotel and a restaurant, and one of the stations in Richmond, Virginia is a science museum. Two old high-rise office buildings in downtown Los Angeles are being adapted to provide housing for the elderly, and I know I've seen a project here that you are considering just along those lines. Trolley Square in Salt Lake City has been turned into a shopping and entertainment complex called Trolley Square. And finally, in Washington a few years ago, the Trust acquired this building, which was the first luxury apartment house to be built in Washington in the early 20th century, and housed Andrew Mellon when he's Secretary of the Treasury and was forming the National Gallery. It now houses the offices of the National Trust. The fourth initiative, which is relatively new to the National Trust, is maritime preservation, where we're helping to preserve not only historic ships, but shoreside installations and maritime skills as well. The fifth initiative amongst preservationists today is a recognition that those who rehabilitate and maintain old structures, from the Chrysler Building, the New York City landmark, which has just, by the way, had all its lighting in those arches at the top restored. It's quite a spectacular sight on the New York skyscape at night. And then, of course, there are commercial buildings all over America and in this community that are undergoing the same type of rehabilitation, particularly encouraged by the recent tax acts, which I believe we will be hearing more about tomorrow. And finally, historic preservation means saving historic open spaces and rural landscapes and the remaining uncluttered approaches to small rural communities. The Mid-Atlantic office of the Trust has embarked upon a demonstration project in which the National Trust will help identify the potentials of small rural communities and the problems and solutions involved in their preservation. The possibilities of preserving rural landscapes, the dynamics involved in retaining old farms, which support the feed, seed, and farm equipment stores, and without which many small rural communities would die. Thus, our commitment to historic preservation has brought us to an interest in a community's economic base. We have come to realize that there is not much use in preaching the sound doctrine of historic preservation to merchants who cannot afford to rehabilitate and restore their stores, or to homeowners whose communities are dying, their economic lifeblood drained off by subdivisions and suburban shopping malls. And so a few years ago, we launched into what we called our Main Street Project, which took three towns, Galesburg, Illinois, there we go, Madison, Indiana, and a third property in the further west. This has been one of our most successful undertakings. It was privately funded by a private roofing firm, Bird & Son. It has proved so successful over the years that the federal government has come in and pumped a great deal of public money into this. So we now have Main Street projects taking place all over America in different states and in different communities. Well, I think you can see this is quite a change from just preserving a famous general or politician's house as the best place in town. I said earlier that preservation represents an evolving ethic. Well, what is the ethic of historic preservation today? What are the common threads that run through the saving and showing of historic museum properties and neighborhoods and business district revitalization? Adopting sound old buildings to new and profitable use, saving our maritime heritage, saving open spaces and rural landscapes, and helping keep the business districts of small communities economically healthy. Well, first, I believe we now have the almost universal recognition that we no longer have to look to Europe for our models. And I think the bicentennial, I was discussing this earlier today with someone, the bicentennial had a great deal to do with that change of feeling. We have the Chicago School of Architecture, the Wright Prairie School, our own adoptions of Palladian and Georgian architecture, Roman and Greek revival styles, and so forth. In other words, I think we have become comfortable with ourselves and our accomplishments. Secondly, I believe the majority of our citizens are accepting the fact that we have to conserve energy and conserve our national resources. More and more of our citizens accept the fact that as a society and as individuals, we can no longer indulge in a throwaway culture that has so depleted our rich treasures of minerals and fuels, that has littered our landscapes and has worked havoc with our downtowns and our countrysides. And related to this, I would identify as a growing respect for the tradition of the true craftsman. People truly coming to appreciate in the older buildings, which could probably never be done again today, based on the economics of labor. Next to a high-rise office building erected to get a fast tax write-off, or a laundromat or a used car lot, an otherwise undistinguished building dating from before the 1940s seems attractive indeed. Thirdly, I believe that we now yearn for stability in this age of bewildering change and awesome threats. When I speak of stability, I mean a continuum in our environment. When you stop to think of it, each has our own personal landmarks. These are not necessarily the officially designated National Historic Landmarks, that we may not even be locally designated landmarks. I'm speaking of, say, the family homestead, or the hospital where you were born, the school buildings where you were educated, the church where you were married, your own first home, the old familiar buildings that have made your own community and your own past unique in all the world. Something happens to you when you return after many years to find a fast food place or a used car lot where you once lived. There was that marvelous Snoopy cartoon that once came out when he went back to the Happy Hill puppy farm and found it had been turned into a parking lot, and his comment, "Someone is parking on my memories." So I think something does happen to you when the corner drugstore is bought by a chain, torn down, and replaced by a supermarket with the drug counter off in one corner. And at this point, reading the national news, you really begin to consider the current recommendation that we allocate perhaps $4 billion to evacuate our cities under nuclear attack. Do survivors, if any do survive, want to survive to survey the total destruction of mankind's natural and cultural heritage? And fourth, I believe that we are finally realizing that we can't leave our problems and our environment to other people to take care of. They simply won't do it. We have learned in the preservation field and in the conservation field, which I think of being one and the same, that we have learned that we must struggle to keep what we want to keep in our environment and to exclude what we don't want to have. And finally, I suggest that we have come to look upon our government as a tool to be used. We recognize and use the partnership of government and citizens in our preservation efforts. Just that partnership now threatened. Whatever the reasons, preservation has grown by great strides in the past 20 years. For example, when the National Register was first published in 1969, it contained fewer than 2,500 entries. Today, there are more than 20,000. Approximately 1,800 of these entries are historic districts, which encompass an estimated 1 million structures. In 1965, fewer than 100 cities and counties had landmark and historic district commissions. Today, more than 600 do. We estimate that there are 5,000 organizations active in historic preservation today, including more than 32 statewide organizations. A decade ago, there were 2,500 organizations, half as many, and only 10 of those were statewide. As for the Trust, in 1981, through programs such as the Neighborhood Conservation Program and the Endangered Property Fund, the Trust has awarded $2.8 million to 200 projects that have generated nationwide a public investment of more than $25 million, a leverage fraction of 1 to 9. A marvelous success story. Yet in the presidential budget for 1983, there is no money for historic preservation for anyone. If allowed to stand, there would be a dismantling of the very successful federal, state, private partnership that has been in place since the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. Therefore, preservationists at this moment, and I'm sure many of you are among them, are hard at work trying to convince the Congress to restore the funds to support a program Congress itself dictated many years ago. You may recall that phrase, "You've come a long way, baby." In 1968, I became president of the National Trust, just as the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 began to function. I participated in the spectacular growth of the movement in every sector. In 1980, I left secured my confidence for the future of historic preservation. Now, in 1982, we may have to start again, ridiculous as it seems. Yes, we have come a long way, and with the support of the millions of preservationists such as yourself, in this country, the road need not end. What better way to celebrate Historic Preservation Week than to confirm our belief in what has been termed as an ethic for the 80s, that is, historic preservation. Thank you for having me with you.
Are there any questions?